Hello, WCA. Mike Amori. How is everyone this evening? If you're watching this in the evening, this is our Week 7 update. We did skip a week because of the power outage, so we're only going to be doing 7 weeks this term. This is the 4 o'clock video for the remainder of the game that we played in class. You may have noticed that the games we played were extremely sharp in class, and there's a reason for that, because the game we reviewed, which started as, let me correct that, as D4, E6, and I mentioned to you in class that sometimes players with black who are intending to play a Dutch defense, which is what happened in this game, after C4, only now does black play the move F5. So by waiting a move, they get to avoid some of the sharper lines. But please keep in mind, if you ever do play a Dutch defense and you start by playing E6, that white could very easily just move the E pawn, and now you're in a French defense. So Ivanchuk with the black pieces was willing to play a French against Alexei Shirov with white. And I'm going to go pretty quick. This was played in Manila in the Philippines in 1992. This was during one of the Olympiads. And here's that move F5. And this is one of the reasons that your games got very sharp, because black takes a bit of a risk in the Dutch that they move the F-pawn, which really doesn't help you develop a piece. If anything, it weakens some squares around the king, who is obviously not castled. But there is an upside to this. This F-pawn very quickly, very early in the game, starts to influence the central squares, especially E4. And if white fianchettos like they do in the game, you can see that later in the middle game, one of black's plans is to push this F-pawn, which could help open lines to the king, especially if black gets castled kingside. So if you can look ahead, this F-pawn could be like a little lever to open up lines for a rook on F8. You can imagine a queen swinging over to this diagonal to attack. So the Dutch defense creates opportunity for white because black is moving a pawn on the side of the board, but in the future it also gives black some chances to use the F-pawn, which is normally not used that early. That's why you guys got such sharp games in class. You played very well, by the way. So Ivanchuk just develops the knight. And let me just quickly say to you why the move G3 is played, because in these Dutch defenses, white usually wants to get the move E4 in and to try to get this pawn to trade and maybe weaken some squares some more over here. But you can't really do that if you put the bishop on this diagonal, because you're going to have to play E3 first and then develop the light square bishop. So that's why you see a lot of players fianchetto here, because then from G2 the bishop can influence the E4 square. So Ivanchuk plays knight F6. Now bishop to G2, and an interesting move here, pawn to C6. And there is some depth here. There's a reason why it's played. It has something to do with the knight on G1. It also has a secondary purpose, hello Ben, in that it kind of blunts this bishop. The word blunt means to dull. It shuts the bishop out from messing around here on B7. But this is an interesting move, C6, because one option for white in this game is to develop on H3 and then come into F4, which is a really strong square for the knight. And Shirov with white knows that one of the ways that black can play is to create a stonewall position. And that's what happens in this game. And a stonewall position is when this pawn here on D7 is here on D5. And if you do it too soon, then the knight has the option of coming to H3 and then into F4. And that would be, a really good square for the knight because it's hard to kick out. If you play knight H3 straight away, then black can kind of change plans and put this pawn on D6 with the idea of playing E5 in the future, kicking away the knight. So I hope that makes sense to you. That's one of the reasons why he plays the move C6. So Shirov just puts the knight on F3 anyway, and only now does Ivanchuk go for the stonewall formation. As chess players, this is one of the structures that is a must know. Whether or not you play stonewalls straight away, you will get stonewall positions at some point in your chess career, and it's a good idea to know how to handle them. There's a tremendous upside for white playing this way, black rather. You can see that the light squares are like concrete. It's very hard to break through that. That's why they call it the stonewall. But in return for the light squared strength, you have to have dark squared weakness, especially this square on e5, which is already an outpost for white. If you're playing white, you try to steer your opponent into positions where the outpost is very useful for you, and then maybe trade off their good bishop, this one here, and leave them with this very bad light squared bishop. If you're playing black, similar to the French defense, like with the pawn on e6 on move 1, as you saw Ivanchuk play, let me just show you that really quick again. So d4, e6, right? This is not a pure French, but this is the first move that black plays in the French. Well, look at this bishop. So clearly, black is going to spend time getting this piece into the game. If I show you the stonewall position, which we have here, you can see that black, oh, go away, what are these things doing here? Oh my goodness gracious, come on. There we go. It's amazing this computer knows I'm making videos for you guys and it just pops up. So anyway, this light square bishop clearly needs to improve itself later in the middle game. Okay, so just some standard development. Castles for white, bishop to d6, which is a beautiful square for that piece, and now b3. And b3, there is a positional idea for white. White would love to trade this dark squared bishop for this one here. And if they can play the move bishop to a3 and trade that piece, that would leave white with a good light squared bishop against a bad light squared bishop for black. So Ivanchuk with black knows what Shirov wants to do. He wants to play bishop e3, so he prevents it. He plays the move queen to e7. Now, if white really wants to play that move, sorry about that, they could play the move a4. And if they play a4, now it's very hard to stop white from making that trade. So one line goes, you just play a5 to stop white from gaining too much space, and you let white trade off the dark squared bishops. But by doing so, they've spent a lot of time, and now they have a knight on a3 that's definitely going to have to improve. So this is clearly playable for white. Okay, you guys see that? So the bishop cannot come to a3 right now. So Shirov just ignores that plan of trading dark square bishops and plays another thematic move in the stonewall for white and centralizes that knight right on the outpost square. And that is a really, really strong square for that piece. So black continues developing, castles the king, and now knight to d2, not knight c3. The reason white puts the knight on d2 is so that it can support the knight on e5. If you put it on c3 and you look at the pawn structure that black has, the future of this knight is really not as clear. Here it has a very, very clear idea of coming to f3 and supporting the knight. Okay, knight on b to d7. And now the move knight d to f3, just like I mentioned. So what is Shirov doing? He's developing the piece and he's supporting the outposted knight on f3. Ivanchuk puts the knight on e4, and you guys were already on your own in this position, but I'm just showing you the continuation here. And now a backup move. White does not allow this knight to trade right away, because what white sees is that, let's talk about this for a minute. Let's go back to this position. Why play this knight to this square? It looks pretty on e4, but it's not really attacking anything yet. I mean, I see the c3 square, but one idea might be to take this knight at some point on e5 and then play the move b6 to develop the dark squared bishop, the light squared bishop. The problem now, if you try to play b6, you're going to hang the c pawn. And I think Liam actually hung the pawn during your training session. He just forgot, played b6, and then whoever he was playing just snapped off the pawn. So what happens is black puts the knight on e4 so that when they do take on this square, when white takes back, it's not a fork because you'll lose a piece. So Shirov says, you know what, I don't want to let you trade. I'm going to back up and let this knight stay on d7. But, it's give and take. When the knight does go back, that allows Ivanchuk to play the move pawn to b6. And he does. He plays pawn to b6. And clearly the idea is to develop this light square bishop. Now a little switcheroo. The F knight jumps into e5. And they're just kind of playing a cat and mouse game using that strong square, and it comes in to attack the c pawn, which Ivanchuk defends, bishop to b7. And I wrote in the notes to the game that, this is not the world's greatest bishop, I admit it, but it's defending a very important pawn. It's part of the stone wall. So for the immediate future, Ivanchuk is not going to change his pawn structure until he completes his development. Then he can think about maybe doubling up on the f file or pushing the pawn to f4, but he doesn't want to weaken the structure until the pieces are ready to change the structure. So right now the bishop, its job is to support the back end of this stone wall, and it's doing an important job. Okay, here white decides to make a trade. Take off the knight, queen takes. Why make the trade? Because now you kick the knight, and the knight goes back, and now c5. So what he did is he removed one of the pieces, thinking that he can push the pawn down and now misplace these the black pieces. However, do not forget that by playing the move c5, Shirov is thinking something else. He's trying to cement this stone wall. Look at what I'm doing. I'll highlight these for you. Let me get my green spray can. Look at that. I'm so accurate with this can. Do you see how this pawn move c5 cements these squares and absolutely shuts down this bishop? Well, it does and it doesn't. You see, because after we take on c5, there is another diagonal for the light squared bishop. Takes with the knight, hitting the queen, and a knight this strong, it's very hard to tolerate in your position. So Ivanchuk takes it, pawn takes, and even though the game is opening a little bit and white has the two bishops, Ivanchuk has something in return. He has a trio of pawns in the middle. And this was kind of a forcing variation, these trades. So I think Shirov was going for the move e4, which is what he played. His idea was to completely open the game. Now, you should all, as WCA students, understand why. He wants these light squared bishops and dark squared bishops to get in. He's got two of them up there, two bishops. Black has a knight and a bishop. But here, e4 was a little bit of a mistake because Black doesn't have to take right away. Instead, he activates the bishop, and it turns out that by playing this way, the F file is going to become the critical line in the game. And I think Shirov missed just how important that line was. Well, he needs to do something with his rook. He chose to get off the line, but what that did was it gave Ivanchuk control of the F file, which he exploits beautifully. He takes the pawn. White takes back. So pawn takes, pawn takes. Now check this out. Let me put some highlights on for you. Do you see how the F file has opened? And if we had to make the argument, we would say that it's in Black's control. And look at the G4 square. That's really useful for a knight. And if the knight can get into that square, which it will eventually, Black is going to have complete control of every square in White's camp on the F file. But before doing that, he plays D4, shutting down the center, closing it. And if you look carefully, it's pretty cool what Ivanchuk has done, is he's closed off the two longest diagonals in the game. the A1, H8 diagonal is the longest dark squared one, and the H1, A8 is the longest light squared one. Well, those two bishops that I was talking about, their longest diagonals have been closed down. Plus, this D pawn is a real pain in the neck, because as this middle game goes on, I mean, trust me, this is not an end game. The primary purpose for black is not to promote this pawn yet, but it's like a bonus. He just has it here. In case the middle game doesn't work out for him, he has excellent chances in the end game to queen that pawn. So, you know, hopefully this makes sense. So queen to d2 is played. He's planning to move the dark squared bishop on this line. That's why he played queen to d2. And now a very simple plan. Knight to g4. Look at those squares. Look at the plans. Rook up, rook over, queen over, knight controlling f2, and don't forget about this bishop on a6. All of the black pieces have their eye, or at least in the future, on the f file, and it's the only line in the position that really makes sense to use. The rest of them look nice. I mean, look at this beautiful square here. If you can get a bishop here, and I think Shirov actually tries to do it, or if he had a knight, that would be great, but you can't use it. That's the problem. So bishop h3, trying to remove the powerful knight, and Ivanchuk says, go ahead and take it. If you want to weaken all the light squares around your king, give up your light square bishop. He plays with the other bishop, and I think he's going for the plan I mentioned. Bishop here, bishop here, bishop here, but it's too slow. Watch how Ivanchuk just takes the file. Queen comes to f7. Bishop to b4, and now rook a to e8. The idea is to lift the rook. Bishop comes to a5, trying to activate the piece, and just compare these two bishops, the light square bishop and the dark square bishop. The light square bishop is controlling the penetration square at the top of the board and all the light squares in between. The dark square bishop is in a desert. Rook e6, the rook lift. Bishop f1 is the challenge to combat this light squared bishop, and now knight f2, sacrificing a piece. Shirov takes the bishop on a6. Black plays one move, white resigns. Can you find it? Queen f3. Pause the video and you can understand why it ended here. The key idea is when, after this pawn move d4 was played, you just had to spot the access into white's position, and that was via the f-file. Beautiful game by Ivanchuk. All right, Grandmasters, we'll see you at the Simul.